Hi, I'm Bryan Koon, President and CEO of IEM. I'm here today to talk to you about the findings of the President's Council to Assess the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which released their final report yesterday on May 7th. The council spent over a year meeting with hundreds of stakeholders and collecting the comments of thousands of interested individuals across the country. And they consolidated all of their findings and recommendations into a roughly 75-page document, and they came up with 10 recommendations and many more recommended actions that they believe will help improve the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the way that the United States deals with natural and man-made disasters. So I want to spend a few minutes today highlighting some of the recommendations in this document. Specifically, I'm going to spend time on the financial implications that are associated with some of their recommendations. I'm choosing to do that for a couple of reasons. One, it's a fairly significant shift in the way that the nation allocates disaster funding between the federal, state, territorial, tribal, and local government. If implemented, if everything in here were implemented, it would mark the largest shift in the way that the nation approaches disasters in decades. So I think it's worthwhile to dive deeply into each of the parts here to highlight what it is that they are proposing to change and the impacts on state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, because it's going to take a significant shift in the way that governments allocate their funding for this, the way they budget for it, and how they think about how disasters and emergencies are going to be treated going forward. So let's dive right in. Before I begin, a couple of notes. One, although there are 10 key recommendations in this document, I'm only going to cover the ones that have significant financial implications. I'll be referencing both the final report and the addendum, and we'll put the information on the screen to show you where I am in the document. And then finally, I'm only going to be presenting the information as it is here in the document. I'm not going to spend any time today talking about the potential for these changes to actually be put into effect. I'm not going to provide my opinion as to whether these are the way we should go or not. I'm simply trying to get the information about what the implications are to budgets, and so that everybody can start thinking about how they would adopt to a new environment in which all of these were put into place. All right, let's start. Number one, equip state, local governments, tribes, and territories to lead disaster response with the federal government in a supporting role. This one, not a great deal of implications. The biggest ones are they support the Emergency Management Performance Grant. That's a grant that many states and jurisdictions across the country utilize to fund their baseline emergency management programs. The council recommends keeping those, and in fact, it suggests that perhaps with some of the savings generated from other recommendations in here, that there could be a plus up to that, a one-time plus up to fund some enhancement in capabilities. It does highlight a desire to focus that performance grant on things like mission-ready package development and some other outcomes of that. And finally, there is one caveat on here. I'm going to read it. It says it should be limited to building new capability or capacity through capital outlay equipment once. Then SLTT should pick up the cost for maintaining that new capability or capacity. So that means no sustainment. Right now, EMPG can often be used for sustaining a capability. The council recommends that it be used to start a new capability, but then that be maintained and sustained through local funding from that point forward. All right, now I'm going to jump into recommendation 3, realign the criteria for federal disaster assistance. This is the first one that makes a pretty significant shift. So the first idea in here is to raise the disaster threshold from its current level to one that actually takes into account inflation during a period which that was not changed from 1986 to 1999. They feel that that will more closely realign what was the original intent of having that threshold in the first place, to ensure that the federal government was stepping in when it exceeded the state and local capacity. So that's in this. It's a pretty short section here, but it talks about changing that threshold. And then secondly, and I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit, it talks about an annual calendar year minimum expenditure. In other words, a deductible. All right, so back to the threshold. So current threshold today for a state is $1.94 per capita. In this, they recommend going to $2.99 per capita. That's a 54% increase. For those of you at the county level, if it's commensurate, it's not highlighted in here, but a 54% increase at the county level takes it from $4.86 today to $7.48 per capita. We've talked as a nation about changing that threshold many, many times over the years. In fact, last year, there was a memo from FEMA to OMB that recommended potentially quadrupling the threshold, taking it from what was $1.89 at the time to $7.56. So not a new issue. And it would make a change in the number of disasters declared across the country. The threshold that state, tribes, territories would have to get a declaration would be higher. And therefore, you're going to have less disasters. In the report, they talk that they would 29% of the disasters between 2012 and 2025 would not have been declared, equaling about $1.5 billion or so in federal funding. And so it is, that means averaging 16 per year and about 113 million per year. So that's one of the first major shifts, is those smaller disasters that today qualify for a presidential disaster declaration would not be eligible in the future. And so you would see, again, just less federally declared disasters. The next thing it talks about in this section is with regards to individual assistance, and simplifying and clarifying the threshold for that, and really taking it down to from the multitude of factors that exist today to a much more streamlined number of homes that are damaged and or destroyed, along with some community impact, primarily driven on the home level. And third in here, and I'm going to read it here from this, minimum expenditures. An annual calendar year minimum expenditure should be established for small, medium, and larger states prior to them being able to request a federal declaration. This in the past has been called a deductible model, and it's not new. It came out, in fact, from FEMA proposed that rule back in 2017. It was never adopted. But the idea is that when you have a disaster, instead of getting a declaration and the federal government coming back and funding you from zero on, that you pay a deductible, simply like you do for car insurance or home insurance. And that deductible, you pay all of it before you start receiving the federal insurance. Now, the document doesn't state what that number looks like. It does say small, medium, and large. If you go back and look at the rule and some of the documentation from 2017, essentially what they started at, or they proposed starting at then, was what the threshold was. So specifically, I looked it up for Florida in 2016, and it was based on the 2010 population times the $1.41 per capita index at the time. It was about $26 million. So in 2017, Florida would have had a $26 million deductible, meaning if you had a $100 million disaster, the first $26 million is coming straight out of Florida's pockets, and then the federal government will start paying from that point forward and cover the $74 million after that. This doesn't state that, but that gives you some idea of where that deductible could be in the future. So that's two big changes there. One is, less declared disasters, and two, every state may have to pay essentially a deductible prior to receiving federal funds in the future. Okay, now we'll move on to the recommendation number 4, replace the hazard mitigation grant program with a two-phase funding structure. So the council pointed out, and rightly so, that the hazard mitigation grant program today is slow, bureaucratically burdensome, ineffective in that it doesn't actually start funding things until sometimes 2 years or more past the disaster. And so what it proposes is replacing the HMGP with a new program, which they have proposed calling the Refined Risk Reduction Program, the R3P program. It doesn't talk about in here about pre-disaster mitigation, doesn't talk about BRIC, doesn't talk about 406 mitigation. It's simply talking about HMGP. And so what they recommend is a two-phase approach. One, you get an initial tranche of money within 30 days of the first part of the disaster, so 5%, and then an additional 10% of federal disaster costs within the first 6 months to a year following the disaster. So some things associated with that. One, it proposes that and this is the first time we see it, but we'll see it more in the document, a minimum 50% cost share. Right now, the Stafford Act has HMGP, along with PA, at a 75% minimum federal cost share, meaning the federal government's going to pay at least 75% of the total cost of the disaster or the mitigation. This proposes a floor of now 50%. And so that means that the cost to the state could double. And let me just give you a quick scenario on that one. So $100 million today, federal government pays 75% of it, so they're paying $75 million. State's going to pay $25 million. If it goes to a 50%, now the federal government's paying $50 million, the state pays $50 million. So the state's gone from $25 million to $50 million, cost double, 100% increase in the cost to the state. Now, It also says that there can be incentives that the state can work its way back up towards 75% by doing a number of things to help increase the readiness of the state and its ability to help reduce and prevent impacts from natural disasters. And we'll talk more about them later. But it does, again, recommend changing the minimum cost share from the federal government from 75 to 25. It also doesn't address a few things, which we also need to consider how they might play out. One is it doesn't talk about, right now, a number of states, 16 states, are eligible for an enhanced mitigation program, which means they get 20% post-disaster. This doesn't talk about that anywhere. And so you have to assume that that program no longer exists under this structure, and those extra mitigation funds will not be coming through. It also, and this is something we'll really need to dive into more and learn more about, the second part of the 10% allocation here, they call a strategic mitigation allocation. But it ties it pretty significantly to the National Flood Insurance Program. One of the things in this document we'll get to later on is recommended changes to the National Flood Insurance Program. And I think in order to beef that section up, what they're highlighting here is that 10% should be tied to, and I'm going to read here, mitigate repetitive or severe repetitive loss properties to improve NFIP performance, or reduce risk to critical infrastructure with the intent of improving the performance of the NFIP as applicable, power, water, transportation, communications systems. It doesn't talk about what happens in state and jurisdictions that don't have a huge footprint in the National Flood Insurance Program. Certain states, of course, do. Florida, Texas, California, Louisiana, large number of policies. But there's a number of states who have a relatively small amount of policies. You know, for example, Wyoming, Alaska have, within, 1,600 or 2,000 policies. So not sure exactly how it would align in states that don't have a large NFIP presence, enough to certainly to justify some of the investment there. So interesting recommendations in the mitigation side between the change in the percentage, the change in the minimum threshold, and the strategic use of it. It would compromise a fairly significant change in the way the HMGP program works going forward. Okay, next up is streamlining the individual assistance program into a single direct payment program. One of the things that the council talks about is that the individual assistance program as it exists today is opaque, confusing to both government and individuals who receive it, and far too complicated, and you're not sure what you're going to get and when you're going to get it. And so what they recommend is streamlining the program to one that is based solely on whether your home is uninhabitable or not, either whether you own it or rent it. And everything else is based on that. So what they recommend in this is that if your home is uninhabitable post-disaster, you are eligible for individual assistance, and you can apply for it and receive funding based on either the value of your home, if you own it, or the amount of rent that you're paying if you are a renter. And it puts that at 15% of assessed home value up to $1 million. So maximum for your allocation would be $150,000 in that case. It eliminates the difference between the individual, the housing program and the other needs assistance, and puts it all together. So whatever money you get is going to cover what today is covered by those two separate programs. It's an interesting concept in here. A few things associated with it. One is it would, if you did just this, it would do a few things. One, it would create a higher cap overall, but also reduce the number of potential recipients of individual assistance. So for those folks who had needs post-disaster but whose home wasn't eligible for IA, that means those needs are now going to have to be met by somebody else, either state, local government, charitable organizations, faith-based organizations, etc. It does, although it creates a higher cap, that doesn't necessarily mean that total individual assistance payouts are going to be greater going forward. Right now in the document, it highlights some of that the average housing payout today is about $4,600, and the average other needs assistance is about $1,600. So it's not great overall, but more people are getting it than would get it in the future. Another thing that it does is change the cost share methodology, similar to what we saw with mitigation. Today, the states pay 25% of the other needs assessment. And so they pay a percent of basically a percent, a fairly small amount. In the future, with just this one thing, they propose in the council report that states pay 25% of the entire thing. So you can see that in a larger payout. So for example, in that $150,000 max payout, the state's going to pay $37,500 of that. Now, that's probably not going to happen that often, but the state share, the state cost share associated with the individual assistance program could be much higher in future disasters based on this thing. So some of the costs, again, the cost increase or cost shift that you could see under this system are one, having to support survivors who are no longer covered under the individual assistance program, and two, an increased cost share associated with covering all of the costs and not just those with the other needs assistance. Okay, we're on now to number 6, reform the public assistance program to provide direct funding. The PA program for FEMA is probably one of the biggest complaints that state and local tribal territorial governments have with FEMA funding, the rigorous nature of them, the administrative burdens, the costs associated with running them, et cetera. And so the council attacked this one head on, and they recommend a new program that they are calling here the right here, the Reformed and Partnered Initiative for Disasters, the RAPID program. So how does the RAPID program differ than PA? So one, it's going to be based on a parametric trigger. Now that's probably a whole nother video, but the idea is that there are pre-established thresholds for disasters, and not a dollar threshold, but an impact threshold. So a category of hurricane, amount of rainfall, amount of snowfall, amount of seismic event, tornadic activity, you name it, compared to what's going on in the state, that then this aligns what that dollar is going to look like. But there's a lot of work to be done yet on that piece of it. That's the first part. The second is similar to what we saw in hazard mitigation, a change in the cost share methodology. Minimum 50% as opposed to what's in the Stafford Act today at minimum 75%, with the opportunity for the state through a number of programs to get that cost share back up to the 75% mark. Under the RAPID program, money would come very quickly up front. It would be a direct grant versus a reimbursement model as it exists in the public assistance system today. So the idea is to get the money out there quickly, so the state tribal territorial governments can make quick decisions and get the recovery going instead of having to put their own money up front and work on the reimbursement. It also recommends that, and they did this for the mitigation one, I neglected to mention, that all open disasters shift to this new methodology as well. So in the document, it states there's about $54 billion worth of open disasters. There's also about $7 billion worth of unexpended mitigation funds. So about $61 billion of hazard mitigation and PA systems could be shifted to a new model and really inject a lot of funding into disaster recovery across the country to help expedite some of the slow programs that we have seen today. Some of the other things associated with it, there is language in here which suggests that they're going to increase the requirement for insurance coverage on public buildings. So there could be some shifts to what is today called Category E under the Public Assistance Program. And going back to the memo last year that FEMA sent to OMB, they suggested similar reductions on Category G. So you could see a shift in what FEMA is covering in future disasters. And so as you review all of this, pay attention to that and think about what may be or may not be eligible for FEMA declarations in the future. A couple of other things to note in here is that one of the things they want to do is reduce the administrative costs of disasters. And they want to do that by, one, creating a much simpler program, allowing states to run everything using state laws and requirements, et cetera. It does actually suggest and call for the elimination of what is today called Category Z, or administrative funding. It doesn't say Category Z in here, but basically it says the only administrative costs associated with this new program are for auditing and for the A&E, the architectural and engineering costs associated with projects themselves. So today, the system it's the money for whatever needs to be rebuilt and improved, plus the administrative costs associated with that grant, both for the federal employees to do it and then the state and local tribal territorial. There's the additional funding on top of that, as prescribed in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act from 2018 that highlights specifically what that can be. This proposes eliminating administrative costs and any administrative costs simply coming out of the block grant, the direct grant that the state has received, with the idea that if you're having to pay for it out of the direct grant itself, you'll be motivated to reduce those administrative costs as much as possible. So pretty significant proposed changes in there. Again, that 75% to 50% cost share is a doubling, a minimum of doubling of costs associated to the state, tribal, territorial government. It could be even more. Oftentimes post-disaster, the president will do 90% or 100% of costs for the first number of days, or if it's large enough, if you eliminated that, and this isn't saying that is going to happen, but if it did, costs would go up 4 or 5 times or more to the state, tribal, territorial governments. But at a minimum, if you didn't meet any of the objectives in there, your costs to do the recovery piece of it would at least double and potentially more going forward. So worth spending some time on this section and taking a look at how it could impact you. I'm going to spend a little time on number 7, which is reform the National Flood Insurance Program. There aren't a great deal of direct costs to the state, tribal, territorial governments associated with reforming the National Flood Insurance Program. And in here, they do highlight the challenges the NFIP has had for decades, which are it's underfunded, it underperforms. Congress, has to bail it out every few years. It doesn't collect enough premiums to pay the policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they propose rectifying that in a number of ways, privatizing as much of it as possible, charging actuarially sound rates based on the risk that the policy actually has, and doing buyouts on those repetitive lost properties that are paid out every couple of years. All of them are interesting ideas. Now, so again, not a great deal of direct impact financially on that. There is indirect impact, however, though. When you change insurance rates and likely increase in insurance rates, there's some potential reduction here. But if you increase insurance rates, a few things could happen. One is big property values will decline because the cost of insurance will go up, and so homeowners will be able to pay less for the house. So property values could decline, which could impact property taxes. So revenue taken in by state, tribal, territorial governments could be reduced from that. You could also see a reduction in sales tax revenue because people are having to pay additional monies for flood insurance policies, if that is the case, and then there's less sales tax revenue generated at state, tribal, territorial level as well. So potential impacts, but those are indirect financial impacts, and we'll need to spend some time later on to figure out what that actually looks like. And moving on to number 8, maximize every dollar spent by reducing administrative costs. Covered already a little bit in the change to the public assistance program, where it talks about reducing or eliminating that category Z administrative costs. Same thing kind of covered here, where they're trying to streamline the programs so we as a nation have to spend less time running the programs, processing the programs, actually spending the money and doing more with it. So not a ton of direct changes to this. I will point out again that if you eliminate the administrative costs associated with these programs, there's still work to be done. And so the recipient of that direct grant, either mitigation or public assistance or whatever we call it, is now going to have to use funds from that to administer the program, whereas today those funds are put on top of what is already designated to accomplish that. So there will be some reduction in the amount of work to be done if you eliminate administrative costs altogether. So something, again, we need to start and figure out what the impact of that is going to be on the total amount of funding that states are going to have to pay to run these programs in the future. And then the 10th recommendation is skip number 9. There's no real impact financially. Number 10, a transformed agency highlights some changes. One is that the transformed agency should deliver any cost savings through staffing efficiencies back to the state, tribes, and territories. So, they suggest that additional funding that FEMA saves can be pushed back to the states. And secondly, there's a big push in here to have state, tribal, territorial governments do their own training instead of having FEMA do the training. So again, not huge, but there would be additional costs associated with those training having to be done out in the field instead of being provided from FEMA as it is today. So I've gone through the 10 recommendations and the bigger financial implications associated with each of them. I want to circle back to what are some of the incentivizations that are associated with this that would allow jurisdiction to move up on some of the allocation, right? So get from 50% back up to 75% or more. And there's a chart on page 17 of the document that highlights some of those. Some of them are not great, they're preparedness related, response related, mitigation related, program related. Some of them, however, are specifically financial in nature. So I'm going to highlight some of those. One of them is that the STT entity maintains 100% insurance on past permanent work projects. Now that's required already So not likely a major change there, but of course, buying insurance, is a financial cost. Second is that the entity has a minimum of 5% of their state budget in cash reserve. That's a pretty significant number. So for example, in Florida, where I live, the annual state budget's around $100 billion. So this says that Florida, has $5 billion in cash on hand. When you take that across the country, right now, the total of all state budgets across the country is $2.9 trillion. So 5% of $2.9 trillion is $145 billion. So that would be $145 billion in cash reserves across all the states to be prepared for disasters. Next, the STT entity has a disaster reserve or relief fund that the governor can use. Now, it is potential, it doesn't say in here, that fund could be associated with that cash reserve that I just talked about. But basically, the idea is that each state has its own reserve fund so they can pay things like the deductible, their cost share, some of the other things associated with that. Here's another one. The STT entity has 50% of their buildings and infrastructures covered by hazard insurance. So the idea here is that instead of relying upon the federal government to reimburse you if a disaster occurs, you have flooded, or you have insurance, private insurance, on your government buildings. Now, this might be intuitive, that having insurance is a good thing, reduces the reliance on the federal government, but it is an enhanced cost to the STT and local governments who now have to pay, if they weren't before, insurance on their public facilities. And so aggregated across the country, that's going to be a fairly significant number. It might be even more than what FEMA would have paid out if a disaster actually occurred. So we're going to need to take a look at as a nation, what is the cost of this private insurance? And does it make, does the math on that work for everybody? This one is the SCT has the ability to collect, validate, and report preliminary damage. So again, most of them have this at this point, but because of the accelerated timelines associated in this new document, they might need to be additional personnel, additional contract support, et cetera, to ensure that they can collect those damage numbers very quickly. Because in this, unlike a reimbursement model where the state can fully capture all their costs associated with a disaster because of, say price increases or undiscovered damages, et cetera. This proposes a one-time payout with a chance for a plus up, but no guarantee that it's going to be reimbursed. So you're going to need to make sure that you're really able to do that early on. And then finally, a few other things that the STT has: individual assistance program that includes temporary housing assistance, individual and family grant program that includes crisis counseling, disaster unemployment assistance, and disaster case management. So again, programs that the state may or may not have today that they're going to need in order to help drive the reimbursement up from 50 to 75%. Okay, so that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. I have a few recommendations for you. One, read the document. It's 75 pages. It's dense, but it's chock full of really interesting suggestions. And I want to encourage all stakeholders to really understand what's in here so that we can have a conversation about what's the best way to utilize this document, how to implement it, and what is the best agreed upon solution for the country as a whole. So spend some time with it. I particularly want those who are responsible for budget. So governor's office, state legislatures, county commissioners, state budget officers, League of Cities, mayors, think through what are the potential financial impacts to your jurisdiction based on these changes and how long it's going to take you within your own budget cycle to be prepared for that if they come to pass. Because the last thing you want is for the disaster to happen, these policies to have been implemented, and you're not ready for them, and you're unable to meet the new challenges associated with paying for the response, recovery, and mitigation from those disasters. So spend a lot of time taking a look at that. Second, we have put a simple calculator on our website at IEM.com. Again, that's IEM.com. You'll find a calculator to help you determine what the impact would be to your jurisdiction. So you can see side by side with the same disasters what the cost is to you today versus what the cost would be under these proposed changes. Now, it doesn't capture everything in here. It really captures the big stuff, primarily the deductible and the cost share and some changes to the IE, but it does give you some sense of what your new costs could be. And I will tell you that in most cases, it's going to be double or more to your jurisdiction. And that's really the point of this whole thing, is to think through how you're going to be prepared for and fund these disasters in the future. So thanks for all of this. Eager to hear comments, questions from all of you. And if you have ideas or feedback for how we can improve our calculator, or you want some analysis of other things in this document, by all means, please let us know. Thanks.